Towers in 1956.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My father was an electrician by trade. He passed away when I was 6 months old. My mother was a clerk in charge of ingoing and outgoing military personnel at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and she was there for 42 years.
Oh, wow. Do you have any siblings? I know you mentioned your sister.
I have a sister who's my foster sister. She was a high school friend that my mom took in when she was 13. And I have 2 half-brothers, both who have passed away, but I wasn't raised with them.
Okay.
So I was raised as basically an only child.
I was raised as an only child too. And then when I was 14, my mom had my sister Mackenzie. And then they adopted 3 more. So I feel like an only child, except I have 4 siblings now. They're all in high school now. So I know the only child feeling. So you've lived in Twin Towers your entire life?
My entire life.
Can you tell me what the neighborhood was like when you were a little girl?
When I was growing up, you never had to leave Twin Towers for anything. We had 2 grocery stores, an A&P and Liberal. We had a movie theater. We had a bowling alley. We had the Coca-Cola manufacturing bottle plant. We had Unger's Manufacturing. We had a bakery store, a jewelry store, 2 Penny Andy candy stores. This was a pet shop. It was Xenia Avenue Pet Shop. We had a hardware store, a bank, a laundromat, the Boys and Girls Club, a bowling alley, Anna Marie's Five and Dime, Church's Chicken. Everything was down here. Everything was on Xenia Avenue. You never really had to, you were either German or Appalachian. And if you were German or Appalachian, you either went to St. Mary's Church or you went to Otterbein United Methodist Church. And when you died in the neighborhood, you were buried out of Lutheran Funeral Home, which was in the neighborhood on Xenia Avenue. So it was like, even in death, your last stop was in the neighborhood before you got buried. So we had the orphanage up on St. Joseph, and that was ran by the Sisters of Precious Blood. It started out as an orphanage during World War II, and it took the orphans, and then before it closed, it was a residential treatment center for kids. And they would have a yearly festival that would draw in over 20,000 people just up there in a 2-day thing. So you just never had to leave Xenia Avenue. And then about 1962, the highway came along and it wiped out over 5,000 homes in the heart of this neighborhood, displaced over 10,000 people, and what was supposed to take 5 years to build took 10 years to build.
And you're talking about 35?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was 1962. So what was the major change you noticed? You said the housing.
And the major change is you could no longer get to your friends. The neighborhood was cut in half. There was a fence up on where 35 is. There was a fence on this side, there was a fence on that side, and you couldn't cross over anymore. Mm-hmm. Before, you could just walk down the street and you could get right there. So you were cut off from your family, your friends, downtown. You were just, if you lived on this side of the neighborhood, you were stuck on this side of the neighborhood. Now the downtown side thrived because on the other side of 35, they had access to downtown Dayton, all of the amenities that were in that area at the time, which of course Oregon District at that time was Skid Row. It was sort of the red light district of Dayton. But they had better access. So our only access was to walk all the way down Xenia Avenue, all the way down Wayne, and then to get downtown. We did have Route 4 still was in the neighborhood, the bus route, but it still cut the neighborhood in half because most of the people down here didn't drive. And when there was only this side of the neighborhood supporting the business district, then the business district started drying up. They didn't have enough business to make profit. When they didn't make profit, they closed. First A&P closed, then Liberal closed, and then one by one, everything else closed. Even the people that worked at the Coca-Cola bottling plant moved to their new location. Unger's Manufacturing just up and closed. So there was a lot of job loss in the neighborhood.
And that was, right after the directly resulted from the highway.
And then that was followed by the desegregation of Dayton Public Schools. So there was a huge amount of white flight in this neighborhood. Pretty much the rest of the affluent people in the neighborhood that could get out of here, they moved out to the suburbs because they didn't want their kids mixing with the kids from the west side.
Okay.
So there was a huge amount of white flight in the neighborhood.
And this is still in the 60s?
That was in the mid-70s.
Mid-70s?
Mid-70s with the desegregation of Dayton Public Schools.
When did you start to notice, like the bowling alley, the movie theater? I think last time we met, you mentioned like when you were in high school, you would get out of class and then you go to like the movie theater. Was it?
The movie theater closed probably in the mid-70s, I think around 78. So I was still, no, actually it closed earlier than that because it was closed when I started high school. So it probably closed about 73.
Okay. What about the 80s?
The 80s was kind of rough down here.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of turnover, a lot of crime, a lot of poverty, just people kind of regrouping themselves after the closing of everything. The bakery was still open, the jewelry store was still open. Church's Chicken didn't shut down until probably about the mid-90s. Smale's Pretzels is still here.
I'm passing on right here.
They've been here 105 years plus. They just remodeled, so they'll always be here, hopefully. Now the great-grandchildren our grandchildren are running it. And they seem to be a little bit more business-minded as to expanding outside that building. They're offering their pretzels in different locations now.
Yeah, I think, where did I see on social media? Coffee shop. Ghostlight, I think, has the pretzels now. And then I think the Fifth Street Brewery, the brew pub or whatever, they have the pretzels as well. All right, well, that is good. 90s.
And then when the last nail kind of was when, for the kids in this neighborhood, was when the Boys and Girls Club closed. And that was probably about the middle of the 90s.
Okay. So let's bring it to 2019 current time. From what you showed me 2 weeks ago was, I think, when we last met, the opioid epidemic has hit this neighborhood pretty hard.
When it first started, we had always had people in the neighborhood that used drugs. But the thing that hit this neighborhood the hardest was the fact that before it was coke, it was LSD, it was pot, it was stuff that could kill you but didn't kill you. And people didn't, the people who were using drugs didn't know how to handle something with fentanyl in it, something that could kill them. You know, in the beginning, we had people in their 30s and their 40s that had been long-time drug users dying because they got hooked onto this new thing called heroin. And it really impacted the neighborhood of just watching your neighbor, you know, pass away. There could be 6 or 7 overdoses in one day because they all bought from the same dealer, and it was a bad batch or a batch laced with carfentanil or fentanyl, and they would just think, well, I can shoot up just the way I've always done, and they were dead. And then Narcan came along. Well, Narcan has its advantages and its disadvantages. Narcan saves their life, but Narcan doesn't get them into treatment. It takes them out of a nice high, or actually a death from being dead, brings them back, takes away that high that they've got, and then they just walk away and say, well, we brought you back, have a nice day, and without the treatment. So we had East End got a Federal Department of Justice grant, and we did a lot of research and stuff, and through the statistics and the studies and everything, 90% of all the crime that took place in Twin Towers centered back to drugs, whether it be theft, prostitution, robbery, overdoses. 90% of all the crime somehow was connected to drugs. So it was an eye-opener to say, we've got to get a handle on the drugs. So we put Cornerstone in, which was supposed to be a Suboxone-based treatment center. They didn't dispense here, but they did all the intake and the evaluation. And out of that, the thing called GROW kind of inspired to where the police would go out and Narcan them, and then go back the next day with a team and say, hey, we can get you into treatment, we can get you a bed, we can get you help. And so that helped a lot of people. And then I think as time passed, a lot of the people did pass away. I mean, we had a high amount of overdose deaths in the neighborhood. And I think after a while, people just said, I don't want to die from this anymore. And one of our residents, who now is dead, was Narcan 32 different times. And 32 different times didn't get him the treatment that he needed. And that 33rd time, they brought him back, but he was brain dead. So his family took him off of life support. But every time he had the heart of a gold, he would give you the shirt off your back. He would always tell me that I saved his life by trying to get him off of drugs, but yet every opportunity he could, he just get right back on the drugs. And it's because things in this neighborhood acted as his trigger. And I think he'd have had a better chance if he'd have gotten out of the neighborhood. Like one of our friends, he moved out of the neighborhood. He actually was a photographer, cameraman for Channel 45. He moved out of the state, had a baby, came back up here to visit his dad and to show off the brand new baby. And while he was here, he said, I'm going to go visit some friends. And of course, right away, that one friend gave him that hit of heroin. And he goes back to his dad's house and shoots it up and ODs. Well, fortunately, Narcan brought him back that time, but the long history of drug use, he ended up destroying his heart, and he didn't survive open heart surgery. So he died at 32 years old with a brand new baby. So this neighborhood was his trigger. Now, when he was out living in the other state, didn't even think of doing drugs. But coming back into the neighborhood and hooking up with his buddies, it was like, let's celebrate that new baby. And the temptation was too great.
Around what year did you see the shift from the coke LSD pot to the harder drugs like heroin, fentanyl?
Probably, I would say about within the last 4 years. We've gone through a big, I don't think, it probably hit this neighborhood around 2015.
And then, I know you told me before, but you showed me some houses last week, the nuisance on the premises. Explain that again about police come to the door and then...
A knock and advise or a use nuisance is the police suspect that there's drugs on the property. So the use nuisance process is they'll ask to come in. In most cases, it's without a warrant. It's by the person saying, yeah, sure, come in. Most of the time, people don't think the police are going to find their stuff, even though it's right there in plain view, or they're just so out of it they don't realize it. Well, once the police find felony drugs, then they use nuisance them, which means they trespass them off the property for 365 days. There is an appeal process, but most generally the Use Nuisance Board upholds that 365 days. Is it the solution? No, because it just means that they can move 2 doors down. Does it get them out of the neighborhood? No, because this is their comfort zone. So they just go from one house to another, and they never truly leave the neighborhood.
And then, as you showed me 2 weeks ago too, a lot of these houses become abandoned, people use in the house. You showed me that house across from the elementary school that the guy tampered with his gas. So that seems to be a common thing in this neighborhood. Like every third house or so seems like it's destroyed.
Well, I wouldn't say every third house. It's just isolated pockets in the neighborhood. The way this neighborhood was originally built, the upper half of the neighborhood was more affluent, German. So the houses were built much more structurally sound. They were built out of brick. They were constructed to last forever. In the lower half of the neighborhood, this was where NCR brought up the Appalachians. So it was kind of like throw the houses up quick, throw them up out of the cheapest material possible and as close together as possible so we can get as many people down here to work at NCR during the war. So there's more deterioration of the housing stock in the lower half of the neighborhood than the upper half of the neighborhood.
So from my witness, there's a huge contrast between there's a very nice house and then there's a house that's either burnt down or is boarded up. How does the rest of the neighborhood that seems to be faring well deal with the houses that are not?
It's hard. Another thing that hit the neighborhood really hard, because there is a lot of poverty in the neighborhood, when the loan companies decided to just give anybody a loan for their house and over-mortgage their house at an outrageous, telling somebody that this house is worth $78,000 and putting them in a balloon loan that their last payment is almost as much as what they borrowed or triple. Back when the recession came, this neighborhood really got hit hard with the foreclosures. We had a affluent property owner that had 78 homes in the neighborhood. She was over mortgaged. She lost all of her properties. So one property owner losing 78 properties to foreclosure, and then once these houses went into foreclosure, you circle back to the crime. The scrapyard doesn't care where they get the stuff from. The drug dealers want to have their stuff, so they went in there and stripped them of any precious metals. And once they're stripped of the precious metals, they're not rehabable. They are, but it takes an awful lot of money to rehab a house that all the plumbing, all the electrical, there's holes in the wall. If you got a good structural frame of the house, you can build from everything back up. But why do that when you can just build a new home?
Yeah.
Or tear it down and have nothing there?
We'll reset it. And then you mentioned the cost to demolish a home in the neighborhood.
All of these houses were built before 1972, with the exception of the new homes. So they all have lead and most likely have asbestos in it. So before the city can come in and do any demolition, they have to do a costly lead abatement and a asbestos abatement, so that doesn't go into the dump and stuff. So that raises the cost of demolition down here to anywhere between $12,000 to $20,000 for a normal house being demolished, and almost, I wouldn't say tripled, but probably add another $5,000 to $10,000 if it's a burned out house, because that entire house has to be classified as being contaminated. So it costs much more to dispose of, because they can't do an abatement, they can't do that kind of, it goes to a different kind of landfill.
Okay.
So $1 million doesn't go that far for the city to do demolition.
All right, let's talk about some good things. What's working in the neighborhood?
What's working in the neighborhood is the partnership between East End Community Services, the neighborhood, the school, all of the existing partners, New Hope Church. New Hope has done wonders in taking the block that used to be the Federation block, which has the movie theater and the bowling alley, had the bowling alley, because now it's a daycare center. And they're starting to rehab and rebuild and bring the building back to where things can go in it. This past weekend, when we did the citywide cleanup, there were 3 events going on in the church at one time. A funeral where someone had passed, a baby shower, and feeding our workers from the cleanup. So the church this past week was maxed out with things going on there. They do recovery, 7-day-a-week recovery. And that's turned a lot of lives around in the neighborhood, because the church treats everybody, no matter from what walk of life that they're from, as if they're somebody. And so that's, New Hope has a pretty good turnout of residents, more so than St. Mary's. There's more people attending Mass at church at New Hope on a Sunday than people attending Mass at St. Mary's on a Sunday. Pastor Jeff can have upwards of almost 200 people and it's a walking church. So St. Mary's is a driving church. You drive to get to St. Mary's. So that's a very positive. All of our urban gardens that we have in the neighborhood is positive. We see a lot of repurposing of the vacant lots that we have in the neighborhood being turned into urban gardens. I showed you a couple of hoop houses, and there's getting ready to be 3 more hoop houses placed on Xenia Avenue, where someone had graduated from the farm up here, and now they're opening a for-profit, hope to do a for-profit farm to make money for themselves. So eventually I'd like to see the residents in the neighborhood get more into farming. Of course, you only got that certain amount of time frame that you can grow stuff, but if people can grow things and then share it, then one, it brings community together, they get to know their neighbors, and they work more cooperative with each other.
So I'm gonna wrap up here because I don't want to take too much of your time.
Okay.
It's been really great, and I hope to be able to do more with you to help. Like I said, my background is filmmaking. I want to use my talents to help this neighborhood. So hopefully that's an opportunity over the summer for me to do. But I am meeting before this class that I'm taking. I am meeting with Nan Whaley and the commissioners on Wednesday. I think we're meeting ahead of time before they. So, is there a message for commissioners and or the city of Dayton that you would like to know? If you could just sum it up in a final message. What's
what I want to say, I can't say.
And that's okay.
What I want to say is there's more than just downtown Dayton. Everybody keeps saying that Twin Towers is going to be the next up and coming neighborhood. St. Anne's has built itself up. Oregon District has built itself up. South Park has built itself up, and we're next. So the city has done a great job in listening to Twin Towers. They've always, when we've gone to them, they've always not turned their backs to what we had to say. So the biggest thing that I can say to Nan and the commissioners is, keep up the work that they're doing, and remember that the neighborhoods can be gyms too, not just downtown Dayton.
Perfect. Leslie, thank you so much.
Oh.
Appreciate it.
No problem.
I will be in contact with you. Hopefully, like I said,
Mayor Leitzel always said that neighborhoods were diamonds in the rough. So.
and like you said, I do see. Well, downtown's improved dramatically. I've
Well,
downtown.
with the purchase of all of the major